streamed live on YouTube, and I'd like to welcome everybody here in the room and watching remotely. Before we start with the meeting, I'd like to ask everyone to make sure their mobile phones are on silent and switched off. We will start with 72 seconds of silence to remember those who lost their lives in the Grenfell tragedy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have we got any apologies for absence?
Round the back.
Councillor Bacteria, okay.
And I have an apology from Councillor Benton.
Councillor Benton, I'll have those in. Does any member have any interest to declare? Moving on to the minutes of the previous meeting of the 8th of October. Does anyone have any corrections or amendments to minutes they'd like to propose? If not, I will sign them as correct. Okay. Now I'm going to suggest a slight change in agenda order because Maxine can be with us for a while, but not for the whole meeting. And so I'd like to start with paper A9, the Obion Scrutiny Work Plan, because it includes the reference to the leadership team. And it also, going through the paper, it also, so we'll start by reviewing the work programme. If anyone's got any comments on the work programme as drafted, or are we happy with that? Next, and then the budget working group to note that Stephanie is going to join for the adult social care committee. Everyone's happy with that. And then if we can move on to Appendix A2, which is a draft reference report from our workshop. And it's a draft reference report to the leadership team. And it has been circulated, and I know there are some comments. I just wanted to add myself, I thought it was a very useful process. And we had a good wide ranging discussion, well supported by the GLA and also by our own officers. And since then, I have been to a workshop, NHS workshop actually, where we talked about AI, which underlined recommendations 1 to me, and the importance of it, learning about what other people are achieving, getting into the weeds with AI. So, who'd like to make any comments on the paper or Will?
First of all, I'd like to say apologies that I wasn't able to make the workshop, but I've read the report and welcome the suggestions being made. I also welcome the additional suggestions being made for an additional workshop in January, I believe, because I think there's much to build on here. My suggestion is that we add an extra recommendation in the draft letter to the leadership team along the lines of, please could the leadership team confirm that contingency plans are in place now for each directorate to achieve 26/7 balanced budget, even in the worst case envisaged the amount of government fairer funding formula. Because the purpose of raising the question at the last OSC, if you recall, and thereby moving to the suggested recommendation, which was carried through by having a workshop, the purpose was to bring forward what Callum had put in his executive summary paper last time, which was the last element of the executive summary, that as from May 26/7, we should start thinking about serious transformational change in the council. I suggested that meeting, it was agreed by everybody and adopted in the recommendation that we should examine it now during the current budget round, such that we would be prepared for the worst case as a council, rather than having to react to it without being prepared at the time.
Luke, have you got a note of that? Those priorities. Everyone happy with that? I'll add that on to Joanna.
Do other people have copies? Because there are spare copies there. So I think something it's not in some people's packs. They need a copy of them. Cool.
So,
Of Appendix 2
um,
in the room.
And the additional paper.
Just
no, since I'm addressing the subject,
not sure.
could I also,
if anyone wants a copy, there's one here.
but can I also ask a question of Maxine, along those lines, from a senior leadership point of view, officer core side, as opposed to the leadership.
As we've got Maxine here, would you like to talk about?
And so can I bolt onto that when considering those plans, that there is serious thought about how we might be proportionally reducing our senior manager overhead cost, as well as, if you like, the front resident facing people in the council. That needs to be in balance, and it needs to be seen to be in balance, not just.
Yes, so taking that, taking the last of those first, yes, absolutely. So, you know, any reduction of staffing needs to have a proportion of managers, arguably a greater proportion of managers from a financial point of view than the front line. And I can confirm that there will be senior management savings as a result of our voluntary redundancy programme, and there are also our management savings embedded in some of the other savings, for example, in children's services that you see in the budget consultation programme. So that's the last point first. In regard to kind of contingency planning, so I think a point that the OSC has made in previous last year was, hang on a minute, you haven't fully achieved the savings, but you know, so not all of, about 87% of last year's savings were achieved, 13% weren't. The approach that we've taken to that was having a very sort of strong lessons learned approach. So there was a small proportion of that unachieved savings that were to do with health funding changing, but some of it was because it wasn't accurately and properly allocated. So I am confident that every single one of our 20 million savings proposals this year is correctly allocated against a budget, and that there is an owner and somebody who's responsible for delivering each of those. We have got a savings monitoring process that's been improved, so we've got a single tracker for it. We've got a standardised approach to reporting and a risk-based reporting of all of the tracking of our savings. In relation to backup savings, so there is an expectation that if it looks like the saving is going off track, then the first expectation is that that budget holding department should be proposing alternatives. Of course, but what we don't have is a long list of backup savings, because of course those themselves would need to be subject to consultation. And I would be honest to say that, you know, coming up with savings proposals which should double previous years has been quite challenging. In relation to the point about planning for future years, then yes, I mean the work on that starts now. It's already started, but there are both some savings proposals in the budget consultation that run across multiple years, but also we know that we need to do just to really start now, particularly for what we, you know, until we hear otherwise, we still very much expect will be a cliff edge drop in year 4.
Thank you very much. And just to double check, Mary, we are adding the extra item on the recommendation. Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much. And yeah, I mean, we've made the recommendations. We've discussed it with Callum. We understand. And I just want to really reiterate that when we talk about a strategy pack, we are talking about 1 or 2 pages. We are not talking about an essay. Excellent. And before we leave this page, I just want to draw everyone's attention.
So just as and when, you carry on.
I was going to draw everyone's attention to paragraph 3.8, not to necessarily congratulate ourselves, but to congratulate everybody else on the peer review, same paper, on the corporate peer challenge. And just to note, my personal thanks to the chair of all the committees and the members of the committees, and of course to all the officers who support us to have that judgment on the scrutiny that goes on in the council. We know that we can't be smug and that we have to do much more, but I hope that inspires everybody that we have a good basis to keep building on. Paragraph 3.8 of the overall paper rather than the papers. Claire, you wanted to
Yeah, I
add
just
something?
have a couple of points on this actually, Chair. First of all, on recommendation 2, 2 points there. Do we want to make it clear that this is in conjunction with the forthcoming AI strategy that has been committed to by the council? And also, do we want to make it clear that are we talking about AI specifically or IT generally, digital solutions that can increase efficiency? And then on recommendation 3, which is about culture, we are currently having somewhat of an exodus of staff from this council, and turnovers, I'm sure we'll all agree, can be costly. And there are concerns in some quarters around workplace culture, concerns with bullying and other behaviours. And also, are we making sure that we consider the costs of poor culture, either politically or towards residents, because those also bear a cost? Now, I think to some extent that may be captured in recommendation 5, but I think acknowledging our communities, our assets, is not necessarily the same as ensuring that we have a strong and positive culture towards them, as we will be talking about later in the commitment paper.
On recommendation 2, I think it does embrace the digital services in general. I mean, it says to further develop digital services to embed the use of AI.
I mean, I want to embed the use of AI to the extent that it delivers efficiency, not for the sake of it. Otherwise, we are in danger of looking like it's a bandwagon.
I think that's implicit, but if anybody wants to reword it or suggest that, I think it's fairly clear.
Any old AI.
And on recommendation 3, again, I think I note your concerns, but I think in order
I was
to keep
just
the
really referring to the presentation that we had from the chap from the LGO, which was very strong on that point.
Yes, but I think a culture that supports transformation and empowers staff is one that is good for recruitment and retention.
Okay.
So I'm sort of happy to just really, because I want to keep everything simple and clear. And I think at the moment we've got quite a clear drafting, and I think those concerns that you've expressed are implicit in here. But anyway, Maxine was here to take that on board. So
yeah, and I know that steering in response that we need to give in the future. We're more than happy to talk separately about recruitment and retention.
thank you. Okay, so I think we can move on from that paper and go back to our normal order. And agenda item 4, which is an update on the Grenfell Tower. Well, you know, we have actually and one just here. That's it. Okay. So that was lovely. You'd like to introduce them?
Great, thanks, Dr. Leal. And just to say, this is the second update, as we'll note, the committee, following our update in May of this year, we've committed to updating the committee on a 6-monthly basis. And this is a slightly shorter paper than it was last time, which I hope is welcome. It's focused on some of the key issues that the committee raised at the last committee meeting, particularly around equalities in the treatment of residents, and around the interface with the government's response to the recommendations that the Grenfell Tower inquiry report made. And a specific question that was raised last time around support for housing support for people with vulnerabilities, particularly around PEEPs and PCFRAs. I guess building on the discussion that has just been had, I wanted to highlight a couple of the risks which we put in the paper. One is around making sure we are communicating the progress that we're making against these commitments. And I think there is more work to do to think about how we creatively present what at the moment is a very long and quite inaccessible tracker to people, and understand from people themselves whether some of those changes are landing and whether they're feeling the benefit of them. The second is really ensuring that this work is taking place against a backdrop of much bigger changes, partly driven by the changes in the financial climate and the changes to the funding formula. And I think as we develop a sort of transformation strategy to some of the points that have just been made, we need to think about how we ensure that we protect and enhance, in some cases, I think, the commitments that we've made through this work. I just wanted to flag to the committee, we are keeping a close eye on the government's response to the recommendations. I think there are some areas where progress had already happened. There are some where we're still waiting for a steer in some of the key areas, including following the government's review of resilience arrangements, which I think will be particularly significant. But we'll continue to keep a watching brief on that, and they're exploring implications that those updates might have for the work that we're doing. And I think more generally, the committee challenged us last time to think about measures of success and outcomes and outputs and different ways of measuring the commitments we've made and progress against them. That is still work in progress. There's still some thought that needs to take place. We are thinking about the different kinds of change and the different kinds of commitments that we've made, because I think some of them are standards to be embedded, some of them will feel more like aspirations that we need to find a way to show concretely how to measure, and some are more cut and dried activities that we can clearly show a beginning and an end to. So I think that's all I'd say by way of it.
Thank you. Any questions from colleagues? Well,
Thank you, Chair. First of all, on page 15 at 3.5, I can't help noticing that Ward Councillor's input is omitted again. I did raise this with the original work last year, and it's disappointing to see that our input is just being erased from the picture. Similarly, at 6.10, again, councillors are omitted. 6.9 or 6.10, programme for maintaining organisational memory of lessons learned. It seems as if we want to consult everybody except the Ward councillors who lived it. So that seems to be an unfortunate omission. I wanted to ask as well, when we mentioned the inquiry oversight group and the delivery groups, who is actually on those? And then also, where can residents find comprehensive information about who is on all these various boards and panels? Because it seems to be a sort of spider web of different things that is not very transparent. And then 6.15, which is where I think you asked for committees input and suggestions. I would like to suggest additional steps that might be taken with residents and key partners. I would like to suggest the value of Ward councillors there, which message doesn't seem to have got across, and also the value of the expertise of Lucy Easthope in terms of lessons learned. And I think in 2019, with the Grenfell Recovery Strategy, there was a piece in there, and I think there was page came out of it about lessons learned at that point, which might be informative to this piece of work now. The bit at the end was this business. I'm very sorry, it's too small for my eyes. I could not read it. And just also finally, Mary, my very last point on Grenfell Assembly, which I think is mentioned on page 18. This is not the only reason Grenfell Assembly is needed, has been suggested, and it's been kind of brewing in the background since at least 2023. So I think when we take it forward, which I hope will be very soon, we are clear that that is not the only driver.
Thank you, Councillor Simmons. And just to take that last point first, that is absolutely right. So I've got the team working on the plans for Grenfell Assembly early in the new year, which I know we are next step is to discuss with you and the other ward councillors. But absolutely, this would be one part of it. That would be a mechanism for updating on this work, but it would also be a mechanism for updating the community more broadly across the council's work, but crucially also the work of health and government and other key partners. I'm very sorry for the drafting. That's my mistake. As part of residents, I'd assumed including ward councillors, but I totally accept that they merit a separate mention, given how closely we worked with you both through the engagement on the inquiry.
Given how much time we put into it, and also given the mandate that we have, either the council respects the mandate or it doesn't. The message I'm getting generally at the moment is that emphatically it does not. So that's why it's really important, I think, to pick this up. It's just quite galling to give of yourself and of your time in public service and to be treated like that. So I hope not to see that again here or anywhere.
Understood, thank you. And if we can note formally for the minutes that the intention was to reflect the contribution of ward councillors to that process, that would be helpful.
And I think Claire's point, if I can add, I think Claire's point is well made, not just in this report, but across council reports. So thank you.
And on the lessons learned point, I totally agree. We can certainly learn from Lucy's Toke and some of the other specialists in disaster recovery. We had a discussion at this committee in October about some of the lessons learned from the recovery programme, and there was a challenge from the committee to develop in a slightly more structured way those lessons in a way that would make them easier to share with others, to discuss with residents and to check, and ward councillors, and to check that we haven't missed anything. And I think that is a good way into this question of lessons learned, but I think there's much more we could do to try and formalise some of the things we have learned on the work and going back to the question about the inquiry working group, so that's an internal group which I chair and is made up of officers across the council who are working in this area. Their names are in the report as kind of SROs or as those delivering some of the key commitments, but I'm very happy as when we publish the next update, to be really clear about how that works and what these different groups do. That group is valuable for me because it's an opportunity to bring everyone together and to look at where perhaps we aren't making as much progress as we would hope, or where there might be gaps. But I absolutely accept that we could be more open and transparent about that process in addition to the open discussions here.
And it's worth probably touching on the independent advisory panel, of course, which sort of is a process that allows the work of the council to try and drive forwards this change, ensuring that there are residents shaping and scrutinising and challenging that we're just getting off the ground, as well as broader attempts to ensure that in the same timings that we have these conversations with you, that we organise events locally so that people can see some of that information in more digestible formats than as you rightly highlighted, councillors.
Thank you. Thank you. And I suggest you read the very small writing online, which is what I did, which is why I didn't list it. But Will, I can see you wanted to ask a question.
Yes, I was drawn to page 61, bottom, which talks about the longer term legacy and lessons learned.
Which we're on page A4.
Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong page. Yeah, I'm on the
In which case we'll wait and hear your Paths of Wisdom in the next page. Sydney.
Thank you, Chair. On page 18, the last bullet point, they're not numbered, but in terms of risk and then current litigation. I just had a quick question where the risk of financial resources relates to the £50 million from the NHS that would be allocated specifically, and is that included in this, or is that not included because it wasn't clear?
So yeah, this is specifically about resources to deliver the kind of the inquiry commitments themselves. So sits separately from council and NHS investment in the recovery programme. But this was more about most of the activity described through the commitments doesn't require additional funding. It is the expectation is that it's delivered by council services, but we have identified a couple of areas which will need some additional investment.
Comments?
A comment, just wanted to observe paragraph 6.12 on page 21. You say you found very good lessons learned brief in the main saying. I just want to caution you from having worked on the inside of the MOD and seeing the MOD's lessons learned library and indeed the NATO one. They're very good at collecting lessons identified, building up impressive libraries, but they're a lot less good at drawing lessons out of them and learning them. So I think you just need to be cautious about having an impressive collection of shelfware and actually think more about what you can draw out of the lessons that you've identified, and putting things into effect, making changes, and putting the intellectual effort into analysing, because that's what's forgotten often. The expense is put into the easy bit, just collecting.
Thanks, Councillor Hammond, and I think we echo that sort of scepticism, or at least a recognition that is only the beginning to start to pull those together in a way that's digestible. We've had some good conversations with a small group of staff that came together after the recent Netflix documentary about Grenfell to talk about how we do a better job of connecting staff with the work on Grenfell and with the lessons we've learned. And we've had some really good suggestions from them about what we might do internally to build people's understanding of Grenfell and what happened, of what it means for the council, and what some of those core lessons are. So I would hope that alongside a kind of library, some of which we found very helpful, but I totally agree it all depends on how you share that information and connect people to it.
Lucy, did you want something?
Yes, mine was just on sort of the general fact that it sort of comes up throughout the course that bereaved survivors and residents are not feeling the progress, and just are there, obviously you note that sort of 9 of the 31 project-based commitments aren't yet complete, but are there sort of particular milestones in the next 6 to 12 months which you feel like they will begin to feel this progress? And also, how are we going to communicate what is going on and this progress with them that's essentially not in reports like this or committees, so that maybe we can actually achieve that a bit more effectively?
Thank you, Councillor Knight. I think one of the things we would like to do, partly with the independent advisory panel, is talk about what would make the biggest difference to residents in terms of what kind of information would help them understand the council's journey. I think a lot of what is most important to people, certainly to bereaved survivors and residents that I speak to, are some of the issues around culture and trust, which are probably more difficult to measure. So I think the external review of culture will be a critical milestone. Of course, that is a review which will make you expect some recommendations, and then the question is, how do we implement them? But I think when I speak to people, those are things they are most concerned about. There are, of course, things that they want assurance that are happening across the council. And one of the issues with trust is that sometimes, even when we say we're doing something, people don't necessarily believe it, or they don't trust the information they're getting. So I think there's something about reporting on the kind of cut and dried, clear things that we can show, indicators, and building trust so that people trust that information. But the bigger issue for us, I think, is around culture and around rebuilding trust.
I ask one more question quickly. And secondly, it was just, and I think you might have just touched on this, how are we sort of ensuring that the lessons that we learned from Grenfell remain visible and central as senior staff or staff as they move on? Is there a particular sort of strategy of educating people as they come into a role there?
Yeah, so I think this work on the inquiry commitments itself has been quite important in bringing staff together from across the organisation. I think there is, I know that HR colleagues are looking at the whole kind of employee life cycle, so from recruitment to induction all the way through to exit interviews, to try and make sure that we are threading some of these things through that process. And I think that would be important. But in my experience, often some of the best ideas come from staff themselves about how we can do this differently, how we can connect staff better to residents and to residents' experience, and indeed how we can ensure that residents are involved in that induction process. So the group that we've pulled together, the group of staff we've pulled together, had some really good suggestions about induction, about sessions taking place throughout the year, because I think lots of people come to this organisation because of Grenfell. They come because they want to make a difference and they want to contribute to the Grenfell legacy, but we haven't always made it as easy as we should for them to connect with that and to be part of that journey. And I think that's the next challenge for us.
Thank you. Joanna. Yes, I'd actually like to talk about the tracker. So clearly it does need reformatting. I mean, I did get a soft copy sent to me, and even then it's very hard to track across. Can I actually just look at C12, which is on page 30? You talk about your senior leaders maintaining regular direct contact with communities. It's the very last sentence of that. I think in part you talked about it in response to Councillor Knight's response, but the areas where trust needs rebuilding. And I found myself looking at this going, how do I identify those areas? And I don't, if you want to embellish on your answer, because I think you slightly, and then I'll come back on the other one if I may.
So do you mean how do we identify the areas of the council where trust needs to
Well,
be?
it's the way it's drafted. You say, particularly focusing on social housing and areas where trust needs rebuilding. And I'm saying to you, how are you identifying where those areas of trust need rebuilding? Because you need to identify it in order to then work on it.
Partly, we've done a recent resident survey that is coming through the committee. If it hasn't already been shared with you, I think, but we can share it. It hasn't. Not fair enough to be worked on. But we asked the question about how much trust do they have in the council generally, and how much change do they think has happened post Grenfell. And through that analysis, you can see that generally positions are okay, but there are big differences based on housing tenure and based on where people live. And perhaps unsurprisingly, people who live in the immediate area around Grenfell do not have that same level of trust in and do not have the same sense of progress post. But I think what we're trying to convey through that commitment is that trust post Grenfell is not only about those communities, they have to be there first and foremost, but it's also about other people who feel the effects of Grenfell and the meaning of Grenfell, which I think speaks to some of the questions from some of the other councillors on the committee about how you ensure onwards learning and change, and whether that be about, and that's really about ensuring that we're continuously distilling what Grenfell means, what it meant to fail in those ways, and what steps you have to take across the whole organisation to be able to ensure change is happening. And I think, when you look at the progress that's happened in some of those places like building control, resilience, there's big steps being taken. What we don't always do enough of is really overtly make the link for that to Grenfell and say this is because of Grenfell. And part of it because of different nuances and things, how you articulate things. But it's those two things. But the resident survey is a really helpful way of being able to answer that question.
Do we go into granularity? Because I'm sure your team is very highly trusted in comparison to some other teams. Do we actually look at where the weak links are in that trust, in that chain of trust, but actually we need to focus on bringing those up to your standards? For example?
I think some of it is about particular services that people come into contact with. I think housing will always remain at the centre of that because the stakes are so high for people. This is about where they live. It's fundamental to their kind of health and well-being. But I think there's not just a service angle to it. There's also, as Callum suggested, a kind of geographical, a demographic angle. So it's different people's experience of the council, and not just in relation. And sometimes people have they feel they have the same experience, whether it's parking or housing, and they feel that's linked to where they live or because they're from a particular ethnic minority background. So I think we need to keep both of those things in mind. I think housing is, and it's kind of reflected through the commitments, it is an absolutely critical area to get right in order to build trust, but it's not the only one.
And sometimes it's not just about the team. So although we do have trust with a lot of people, there'll be points when we don't, and there'll be points where we lose those relationships all the time. And it's as much to do with the process as well as the consistency, which is why that commitment of continuous presence, of being in people's lives, and of people understanding who the council is made up of is really important. Because then in those moments when relationships aren't so good, you still know that person is going to be there and doing their best in that position. And I hope that the work that we're doing on the charter, which is another recommendation we obviously spoke about separately, will also try and ensure that culture, that approach, that demeanour, what we want from our from staff when they're working with residents, is inclusive, and that process helps to foster that trust.
Thank you. I think my second one, page 33, a completely different angle, which is the managing partnerships and contracts. So when I read this, I found it moved from giving residents a genuine voice in practice selection and management. And I found myself going, is it selection, i.e. the procurement phase, or is it actually in how they go about delivering the contract, or is it both? And there are procurement rules. And so I found myself looking then across at the next heading, which was residents state that their voice is heard and opinion is shaped in the services which they access and require. And I found this one, there's a layer of legality in here with the Procurement Act that you have to make sure that you are either including them at the right stage early on, or we don't fall foul of bringing them on later in the stage where actually we start altering the contract or we start altering the expectations. So I just felt that one needed more transparency for what we can actually deliver and where we can actually involve the resident. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the recommendation essentially.
Nothing's been asked.
Is there are there any questions from the audience? Meredith, did you want to?
Thank you. Yeah, it relates to
Do
the.
come and sit further forward if you want.
Yeah, it relates to page 19, key areas of progress, councillors last on equalities. I hope I'm on the right paper.
Page
19.
Yes.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, the inquiry report did talk about significant levels of discrimination against certain groups, and this is something that's certainly still on residents' minds, and whether we like it or not, is going to impact long-term trust. So I just wanted to ask if you could just elaborate a bit more on this section, because really all it looks to be talking about is equality impact assessments, which broadly speaking tend to be kind of the baseline minimum of what's required in public bodies. And even that, the equality impact assessment and equalities audit, the findings weren't particularly encouraging. It showed quite a few weaknesses already. So yeah, you could just expand a little bit more on what's being done to address that beyond the equality impact stuff that's in the report.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Ahmed. And so specifically, and going back to some of the failings identified by the inquiry, we see there was specific evidence of discrimination that the inquiry found in the treatment of people in the aftermath. So one of the key areas of work has been in resilience and in emergency planning to make sure that emergency plans factor in the specific needs of different groups in providing emergency humanitarian support in the aftermath. So I guess that's it's a specific example, but the inquiry also identified a kind of broader breakdown of relationships with tenants, which I think they felt showed signs of the kind of social discrimination that I know we heard a lot about through the engagement on the inquiry report. You're right that there is a lot of talk about EQIAs. The audit was broader, and it did talk about how we really connect. It used EQIAs as a way in, really, to talk about the way we connect that work to our broader commitments on equalities and the need to treat all residents fairly. The Fair Action Plan is our kind of key vehicle for that work, and we've made a number of commitments around that. And so that's where our focus is. And you're right to note that the equalities audit wasn't particularly encouraging. It identified some areas of good practice, but it identified lots of work to do. And again, that came back to issues around culture, making sure that equalities are factored into decision making at every level, whether that's a big D decision, a key decision, or day-to-day service planning. And I think it crucially, and coming back to one of the points that has been made about this committee before, it came back to data as well, and how we are using information about where we're delivering services and who we're delivering services to make sure those services are appropriate and meet people's needs. So there is quite a lot of work going on in that area, but I totally appreciate the sort of relatively narrow focus of that.
I mean, resilience planning, of course, is crucial going forward in the event of something just happening again, God forbid, but that doesn't really answer the question about the specific discrimination that certain groups face. Muslim people in particular, and Islamophobic attitudes that were evident in the immediate aftermath. So I don't think that necessarily kind of addresses the point, Joe.
I think just to expand on it, the 6.8, the paper talks about that broader review of culture that I know we've spoken about before already tonight, and I would agree. Maybe we can make sure in the next paper there's more detail around that process. We're designing that with the independent advisory panel, and I think that is an incredibly important piece of work because having worked with many of the communities in the area, I completely understand and hear what you're saying, both in terms of what was articulated then, but still sometimes now. And actually, we need to be able to address and hear and understand that process, because and that's not a process really that we need to go back and speak to the community about, because we've heard how they feel. It's really about a diagnostic approach about what is happening here, because media people sometimes still feel like that, and what's happening then. And I hope that that process will go some way to be able to answer that question in a more holistic way than you currently feel this paper does.
Thank you. Well,
Can I come back? Will you pass me by and then I come back? What I wanted
maybe
to
to ask you a question on a different page.
well, we didn't put it on, but I thought what I find interesting in this one is it comes back to also in terms of what Callum was saying, that there's the foundation of actually getting some basics right. If we don't have a system overall, it's not just in the Grenfell context, but elsewhere in the borough, if we don't do the basic simple things right, it becomes very difficult to establish those high levels of communication and data and trust and so on going forward. So, reinforcing essential case management, following up on things that you say you're going to do, that you do them, and technical competence. And you've got quite a lot in this paper here about checking out on those people we commission, those people we employ, etc., that they are up to adequate standard. Doing due diligence on that foundation work. Then there are the further things that's been referred to by the last speaker about high levels of trust and engagement. If we don't get the basics right, but we aren't going to be able to build further, of course. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we've probably come to that end on this one. I think there are some sort of clear suggestions about, for example, embedding lessons learned being just as important as fancy libraries, about maybe addressing discrimination in a different way in next versions of the paper, and some specific comments on clarifying elements of the tracker in future paper. And I hope that's captured most of the.
And the presentation of the tracker as well.
Sorry?
And the presentation of the tracker as well.
Yeah.
And what councillors.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay.
No, maybe, yeah, that's right.
And we'll move on to paper A5. And we have, if Kieran going to, we're going to come and join us at the. We've invited Kieran here, who is from the Independent Scrutiny Commission. So if anybody wants to ask any questions, he's available to respond. Who's going to introduce himself?
I'm happy to. I can keep it very brief. Again, this is a 6-month update, so we brought the last update in May, and there's been sort of considerable progress, particularly on the Grenfell Opportunity Support Programme and the Education and Training Programme. And this is we are developing. It's worth saying this is a longer report, but we are developing dashboards for each of the programmes that will capture the kind of key indicators. So we hope going forward there will be an easier way to see all of the data at one glance, which is one of the recommendations that the scrutiny function has made, and that we can use these papers for you to focus on key risks and issues. And if there are particular areas you would like us to focus on tonight, or rather in future reports, do please say tonight.
Thank you, Sarah. So you wanted to answer that?
I think what really comes out of this paper is how the team have been working with the different groups, whether it's bereaved survivors or the Grenfell Effect community, and then the surveys, consultations, and then open to change. And I think that's what really comes through to me.
Thank you. Questions? Again, I'm not going to go around. I'm just going to wait for people to expand.
Thank you. My main question, let's have a couple of questions this time. My main question is, where in this report is Grenfell Walk? It really isn't clear, and given how Grenfell Walk have been treated and the impacts of that upon them, I don't know whether the independent scrutiny function have been made aware of the history there, particularly around the bereaved and survivor portion of this support, and what happened in the final stage of that consultation, which has still not been addressed. So I wonder if anyone here can say anything about Grenfell Walk and how it fits into this report, because they have been from pillar to post for 8 years.
Thank you, Councillor. That they are referenced through the data that's set out from in the breeding survival model, page sort of 39, 40 onwards, and in some of the data points afterwards. Is there a particular point that you'd like to express about those experiences?
Well, I mean, for instance, are we learning anything from the figures around the dissatisfaction? So there's data here about percentages of dissatisfaction. And it does say, I think, I'm not completely sure where, but it does say in some places why people were dissatisfied. And albeit I don't know what percentage of the total bereaved survivor population accounts for Learn to Walk.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether how much of the dissatisfaction, for instance, is coming from that particular cohort, which we already knew and which we have not addressed, and how, as a council, in all conscience, we can continue as we are going.
So we have the full responses now to the dedicated service survey that is alluded to here, that we've done the analysis of. And there is some satisfaction in that survey. There is, in the same way that there is in all surveys, and we're working through that process to try and address that as much as we can. What I can say is Grenfell Walk are not overrepresented in that dissatisfaction that's expressed. There is a group of people, Grenfell Walk residents, who some of whom, as others have, but there is not a trend through that survey that suggests they are more dissatisfied than others. There is absolutely an acceptance that the process through that consultation left that cohort of people feeling harmed, and I recognise that, and we try to work through that to try and make sure that we are working to try and address some of those issues that we know exist. Some of the changes that are proposed in the survey and that are alluded to in the paper around the shifts of adults and children being able to opt out separately is something the Grenfell Walk residents have expressed a particular interest in, because the size of their budget was obviously most impacted through that process. And so there are changes that we're trying to make, which I hope will ensure that their financial experience is better as much as it can be. But you know, the satisfaction rates for those people who are opting in is no different from any of the others.
That's reassuring that the dissatisfaction isn't an overrepresentation, but I think we also need to be very clear. This isn't just about the financial situation. It's about what that expresses in terms of the council's attitude towards that particular group. But thank you very much for that answer. And I would just like to ask whether the independent scrutiny function were aware of the issue around Grenfell Walk.
Yes.
I was going to say to you, do let me know if you want to jump in at any stage and have something to add. Twitch or something.
Yes, so I understand that we were aware of that, and actually this point made around the kind of opt-out specifically, that's something that's come out in our past scrutiny. But I recognise equally it's something that we want to continue to kind of focus on in our function as well, absolutely, and to not let those past experiences not continue to be something that comes into the scrutiny going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to just go around and.
Okay, page 65, the educational tab. I'm interested in how this will be implemented. The question I was going to ask is, are you going to address our early interventions, particularly helping people with special educational needs in general settings, because those who are maybe less severe in their need, but with the appropriate, individually appropriate early intervention, the opportunities there to enable them to remain in a general provision case and thrive through the rest of their life. And allied to that, are you working with the team from Children's Services on the development of the Children and Young People's Plan, which is being rewritten the strategy rather than being rewritten this next spring? Because it would be good if appropriate alignment, I know it won't be the same, but appropriate alignment between those two pieces of work.
Yes, in simple answers. So we benefit from having a joint post now with Family and Children's Services, who oversees the education other side of the provision alongside a virtual school and other areas reporting into Sarah Newman. So we have that benefit of that crossover and that reach. And this work is very much trying to take on that learning from seeing the value of ensuring that children and young people are diagnosed early with any speech and language support, they get that wraparound care as much as possible early, And we're working in partnership with academics now, trying to assess the impact that we think, testing that hypothesis, that should have, that could apply learning to others, and to see this as a preventative solution that we might want to replicate once this funding ends.
I know that it's not the same as the Grenfell context, but is a growing body of experience in the borough now where there's co-location of daycare, nursery, and general primary in the same place with SEN provision, either general or special specialist. There are lessons which might be useful to what you're doing.
Certainly.
Thanks, Sharon. Just a quick question on paragraph 2.19, page 44. In the middle of the paragraph, obviously we want to leave no one behind. But with families who do not wish to make any contact with RBKC at all, just a bit concerned as to how we're going to keep them appraised of what's happening and what they should be getting, understanding in a bit more detail who's the intermediary going to be that's going to be between the council and the families if they don't want to have any contact with us at all. Especially since in later paragraphs you're giving budgets and giving money and making sure there's no risk. How are you going to manage not somebody who doesn't want to talk to in any way, shape or form?
So thank you for the question, Councillor. So I think that's one of the reasons why we've done the opt-in and opt-out process, so that actually, if you are in that cohort of people who don't want to have RBKC in your life for understandable reasons, that you can access as much or as little support as you would like, purely through an online solution. So there are some people who have never accessed their budgets. They're in the minority. Some of those, interestingly, are working with us regularly, and they've always worked with us. They just don't, I think, feel that the financial support is something that they want to utilise, which you must respect. And there are a couple of people, it's 2 or 3, who aren't interested in the support, and that's what they articulate. But there are some people which we're trying to capture, perhaps poorly written here, that what we're really articulating is a reality that how we can provide that support without having to have daily contact with us is what this revised model allows for in a way that it wasn't really possible.
Thank you very much. Greg.
Thanks. I think my question is probably for Maxine more than Joe and Callum, and it's in the face of what's the train that's coming down the tracks with the fairer funding formula. How confident are you that you take this programme for its 4-year life cycle? Because of course it's not a statutory programme inevitably because it's unique to RBKC, but it's nevertheless really important to this borough.
Yeah, thank you. It is separately funded. It's funded through the Restorative Justice Programme, so it's got funding that's coming from other companies and the government. And put simply, we wouldn't legally be allowed to eat into the money at all, and of course we wouldn't want to either. Of course, we will need to think about what future support looks like post 2028 at some point, and that financial position is very challenging in the future.
Thank you.
The report on section 4 does explain very clearly that this is a particular source of funding from a legal settlement. So it's in the papers.
Thanks. Lucy, did you put your hand up? Sorry.
Yes, no, I might quite a broad question, just picking up on some of the things that come up as sort of perceived sort of problems, sort of communication failures, delays, and existence of some of the council's services and digital barriers, and bad coordination between departments. I was just generally understanding the type of work we can do to kind of close those gaps on what we're hearing that are the problems that we need to be trying to fix.
Yeah, I think when we encounter some of those through the work that the digital service does with briefing sliders and some through the work that the community advocacy team is doing, I think we're doing some work at the moment to draw together those kinds of lessons and to try and identify some persistent trends. And the ISF has challenged us, the independent scrutiny function has challenged us to think about not just how we're delivering this programme and overcoming those obstacles in the context of the programme, but how we're then using some of that insight and intelligence to share those lessons. For the Grenfell Community Advocacy Team, they have worked in quite a different way. They've worked very closely with colleagues across the council, and I think they've now built good relationships with residents, they've been visible in the community, but actually they've also put a lot of time and effort into working with colleagues, and I think that is helping to encourage others to see where things could be done differently or where we might overcome some of the gaps. I think some of the gaps reflect the broader landscape in terms of the kind of cost of living pressures, the scarcity of social housing and some of those other issues, but some are about really core issues around communication and around making sure that people don't feel that they've been left behind or forgotten about. So I want to see, particularly in the next phase of us, do more work to distill some of those issues that we have captured, not just to solve the problems for the individuals we're working with, but to try and make sure that those broader systemic questions can be solved.
Anyone else? Yes. A couple of things. On page 53, only 33% of the applications of the press to the local community advocacy team from men. I was a trustee at Clement James, and one of the challenges we always had was getting men across the threshold or to engage. Do you see that common across the programme, and how can we engage that cohort more to pick up services?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Gardner, and I think it is a really good one. It's something that we've encountered kind of throughout the work on Grenfell, including through the recovery programme. We've had much higher levels of participation, both in kind of meetings in terms of applicants. I think it's true that for the Grenfell Community Support Programme, the overwhelming number of applicants, the majority of applicants are female, are women, and I think there are a number of things we can do, partly through the community activities budget, which we're still making decisions about how to spend. We had some success with the Grenfell Recovery Programme when we looked at kind of peer-to-peer support type approaches that involve physical activity, and I think there's more work we could do to understand. Obviously, sometimes there are often here it's a lead household member applying for support, and that person happens to be a woman, but to understand whether other people in the household are also being supported. I will look again at the gender balance for the gym membership, because that has been, as you've seen, that has quite an extensive uptake, and so we're going to dig into the demographics there a bit to understand whether that is helping to to counterbalance that trend.
Thank you. Yeah, if I might look up, just on the membership, I think if it is possible, we'd all welcome you finding funding to continue that. Just had two quick points. One for the independent scrutiny. On page 70, in 731, something point 31, you talk about late September reporting on summer term. My concern was that whether that was going to be too late to make changes for that academic year ahead, because essentially academic year is finished in July and you're not picking up reporting until September. So I nearly leave that one for you to think about. And one for our colleague at the end of the bench. Page 86, the independent scrutineers are talking about sharing recommendations in February and March, page 36. We are going to project called PERDA as a council, because we've got council elections at the end of March, so it can really help it to be more February in order that we can actually do something with it, because otherwise we go into that sort of well, there you go.
If I may just on that, yeah, that's a really helpful line for us, and actually this process of exactly how we're developing that initial sort of reporting is sort of a live question for us than the exact schedule. So we'll definitely turn it into account.
Thank you, Chair. A very quick question. 868. We talk about the Norwegian community engagement and the family hub. Point 7.24. There are lots of services that are available. Do we have any data on what the engagement is? So just like, as Councillor Gardner said, the gym and all these services that we're offering, it would be very interesting to know that are these services being taken up? How frequently are they used?
So on the community Grenfell Community Support Programme, that data is in the sort of early sector report around the gym membership in terms of take up. So for the gym membership, we're getting at the moment between kind of 500 and 600 people using the gym on a regular basis each month. We know that we only pay for what gets used.
How many members?
So the number of members who have signed up, I think it's now over 2,500.
So it's been percentage of the signed up.
Yes, exactly. And what we're doing in the next phase is a bit of work to understand kind of whether there are any barriers for those people who have signed up but aren't yet using the gym. And we're also keeping a close eye on those numbers because they have the usage numbers because they have increased quite significantly since we started.
And even on the 7.24, the workshops and activities and all that.
Yes, and
It's just been-
that relates specifically to the Education Hub, which obviously only launched right at the end of September.
Right.
So what we will have in the next report is a really comprehensive picture of exactly kind of how many people have now registered with the Hub and what the sort of take up of that programme of workshops and activities have been. Just while we're on education and training, sorry, on page 63, the pie chart, the scope 1 to support should reach 15k, not 50k. So apologies for that error, but if we could know that, then it's great. Sorry.
No, that's thank you.
Mary, you've moved on before I have a chance to ask my second
I'm
question.
so sorry. You look so as if you've wrapped that one up so carefully.
Sorry.
Do ask for a second
It's
question.
really to emphasise a point that I think is really important. On page 61, the final bullet point, and there was like it's mentioned on page 85, about wider council influencing and the importance of that in the restorative process. And I suppose my question is, how can we make sure that we get this message across to the leadership team? Thank you, Chair.
With both response, right? Or leadership team.
I think the leadership team are aware of it, and certainly what's come out is that it's the way the team's been working across the council at officer level, and I think that the leadership team is the same. I know, Claire, you don't feel that, and I'm sorry for that.
Well, I think it's sort of residents maybe aren't feeling it. We want residents to feel the change. And I think in order to do that, the Grenfell advocacy team is there because of feedback that residents gave. Yes, these are actually health and housing and also national issues. But I think in terms of making sure that we do embed all the lessons collectively from Grenfell and that we do deliver as much restorative and recovery as we can, then we need to be kind of cross-council, cross the leadership, mindful of the relevance of decisions that we make to the potential for that restorative act.
And I think some of the work we've been doing recently with the council comes to you is really important. We've been going out across the borough. I know not all wards have given us some dates yet. That's where some members of the leadership team, local councillors and exec directors or senior officers go out and really listen and hear from the residents. And it's really important, but I know we haven't been to your ward yet, so I hope you can give us some dates on something.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to make a quick point about paragraph 317, which is more a sort of general point about figures. Given us some interesting figures here, but they always, to make any sense, these figures need context, a bit more context, I would say. So, for example, we've got 2,500 new memberships. Out of how many memberships overall for the Kensington Leisure Centre would be useful to know, and also out of how many you could potentially have had. And I think you've slightly given us that in the next one. You said 600 each month with over 3,500 monthly visits in total. So I think you're telling us that about a sixth of visits now to this leisure centre are by people who've got a Grenfell pass, which actually is quite interesting. And so just giving that context makes these figures more useful for understanding really what's going on. But that's not a question.
That's not quite right. So the 3,000 to 3,500 is the number of visits. So 600 are regularly using the centre, and then the total number of visits by those people is 3,000 to 3,500. But we could definitely provide contextual data around overall
And
membership.
perhaps a bit more clarity about wording for
Yes.
those of us who are liable to misread, as I am. No, did you want to ask a question? Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much for that, for explaining your work. And thank you very much, Kieran, for coming and answering questions. We'll move on to agenda item 6, which is the annual complaints. Thank you. Great time of year. Thanks, thank you. Sorry to leave it. Are we getting some signs? So,
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
do we know if everybody is?
In case you don't know us already.
You're from housing, aren't you?
I am from housing, yes.
Housing.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Sophie, do you want to introduce something?
Yes, please. I'm Sophie Evans, I'm Director of Customer Delivery. I'm joined by my colleague Bruce Berry, who is the Corporate Complaints Manager, and my colleague Alfie, who is
Current director.
Current Director of Housing. And I'm hoping that between us, we should be able to answer any questions.
And a whole on the industry, housing command, right? Would you like to introduce your case?
Yeah, I'll keep it short because I'm sure you've got lots of questions. I think the things that I would pull out of the report is that we have seen an improvement this year. For those of you who remember the discussion we had last year, our key concern was around the timeliness of responses, and we've seen a real improvement in that. So that's really good news. We're nearly at 90% on stage 2 and 85% in stage 1. And of course, the intervention of the Scrutiny committee will have come halfway through the year, so we've made quite a lot of improvement since that time, and we continue to make improvements there. The two areas I think are now our area for improvement and focus over the coming year are about escalations. So escalations from stage 1 to stage 2, and escalations from stage 2 to the Ombudsman, and the amount of which, once it's been escalated, there is an upheld decision. And all of those things suggest that at stage 1 we should have dealt with it better. And that needs to be the piece of work that we focus on over the coming year. One of the things you may observe is that in terms of the improvements we've set out, they're perhaps not as thorough as we would usually present. And the reason for that is because we are going to do an end-to-end review of the entire process. And that's one of the commitments you will have seen in the report on the Grenfell inquiry commitments response. So that will start taking place in January with residents involved, the Ombudsman and officers across the council, facilitated conversations to come up with a co-designed set of recommendations. So we wanted to leave some space for those residents, the people involved in the process, to really inform how we improve the service. But there were some things we know we just need to do, and so they are listed in the report. Probably enough, isn't it? Thank you.
It is. Great.
Thanks very much, Lee. Thanks very much for the paper. I'll start on paragraph 3.18, Sophie, which is what you mentioned, the uphold rates per 100,000 residents well under the. So aside from the fact that the population was probably, in our particularly, was probably woefully underestimated in the last census, are there any other explanations you can think of which might explain why we're so far towards the top of the table?
I mean, I think
yes, bottom of the table. As Sydney points out to me,
on the literature,
the wrong end of the table.
So I think the kind of most straightforward answer is we need to improve the investigation and the way in which we make sure we thoroughly investigate all of the elements of the complaint at the initial stage. Because what we're finding is the uphold rates are higher than we expect, which means we haven't been as thorough as we could have been. These are relatively small numbers, of course, that go through to the Ombudsman. So small changes can make quite a bit of difference in terms of the proportion, but they are too high. And I don't think there's an excuse or reason that we can give you that doesn't suggest that we need to improve.
So in terms of having read the Ombudsman's outcomes, as I presume you have, you can analyse those and suggest that we can do better.
Yes, absolutely.
Stage 1, stage 2.
Yeah.
Okay, well at least you know that. And I think Sydney's got a follow-on point, but I did have one just overall observation for future papers. I think the question was asked, would we like to see a comparison of between other years, so we see a trend rate, and yes, I would, I find that useful. And also, if there's any chance of comparison with other boroughs, obviously we've got that in 3.18. It's the only places where we do see that, to see how we're doing against the benchmarking. And then if the data exists, as I suspect it might do, then I find that quite helpful to know where we sit.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm done there.
And just on the Ombudsman
case to say we do get a complete report back from the ombudsman on any investigation they do, and that does feed into lessons and actions that each department takes. So it does, when we get information back from the ombudsman, we do make sure it's something that's part of our learning. But the answer in terms of why we're overrepresented there is that we need to get better.
Who's here for next? Thank you, Chair. For me, it's more of an overarching question, and I preface this by saying that it's mainly from my personal experience from housing. So I don't speak for the department. I think Autumn knows exactly what I'm about to say. I think what, in my experience, we lack is some sort of proper case management. We don't have a system where there's a case management history, where we log the calls in, there's an allocation, to a relevant single department or one department. And then when it comes in, they're not necessarily complaints. I think we can call it cases. And then each case should be followed by either one department and one person. And they should take an agency to keep everyone informed with a particular time frame, the sequence of events, the progress. And even within that time frame, when people are away, instead of just all of us receiving, I'm away till then. I've had a case one time where out of 4 people that I was dealing with, or 5 people I was dealing with, 3 of them were away. And the other 2, and quite often, when people are away, it should be followed up. It should not be left, sitting there till that person returns, because that's often the case. That was one. So residents are kept informed properly. So from inception to maturity.
Yes. If I may, did you want to finish with your?
Yeah, please. And I have some questions.
So, in terms of the case management system, we do have a system that we use as case management. I am aware because we've had a separate discussion and we are following it up with a case review around the specific example that Councillor Hunt has given. But in terms of, and Councillor Pascal mentioned earlier, around back to basics and the case management and information is one of the areas that we're really focusing on, so that we provide that consistency, so that your experience that you've had on that one instance is not.
It's not just one.
The experience that you've had, it's not consistent across the service, because it is not. But we just need to achieve that consistency, and we can only do that through the improvements and really by going back to the basics in terms of doing the case management and doing that follow up. And if they say they're following up, they do, and all those basic things, they will make a big difference. And I think you touched yourself. There is a theme on the complaints that we've looked at, where the follow up and the case management is really, they are the 2 main areas that we need to make significant improvement.
And it often sits in different departments. One department not knowing what the other's up to, or even within the team not knowing what who's responsible for it. And my.
Did you want to comment on that?
No, I think we need to improve. So we do, what we have started doing is making sure where there are complaints that are with multiple services in the corporate complaints team, an officer takes responsibility for liaising with those and making sure a response goes back. And I think it's one of those cases where we have some systems in place, but we probably need to educate people better on how to make sure they use those systems, so there is that consistency. So I think it's helpful to get that feedback.
Or even the officer, actually, if you were to insert that a procedure that the officer who responds to these queries, they should have generic knowledge. And I think that's what goes down more to training.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, I will pass you on to another department, and then it also forces the crack. And I think this not only improves the customer service, but I think it's all part of it, could be a part of a transformation process. Yeah. And there could be huge savings. Chair, I have a couple more, sorry. On page 139, you talk about you talk about the compensation as increased within the last 7 years. 3 years. Do you have? There's no mention of any figures within this report of, if there is an amount when we settle without going to the ombudsman, because they're quite often we settle with residents. I know cases in social housing where we've paid, residents £1,000, whatever. Do we have a figure on that, how much we spend on settling it,
So I can talk in general terms, but Ruth may be more familiar. I don't want to put you in. But we have a policy where actually it guides whether we think a compensation payment should be made, and officers consult that policy and then determine whether an amount of compensation, and the compensation is less about trying to settle the case and more about acknowledging the impact that's on the individual and providing a financial recognition of that impact and to kind of reimburse any costs that have arisen from that. Sometimes an ombudsman will come back and say we should have made a compensation payment, and we'll advise that. But it is something that we do consider at stage 1 and stage 2 in line with our policy.
No, what I meant was, do we have a figure?
But should we have a guide on terms of what gets paid?
No, not a guide, how much
What
we
was
pay out,
spent?
what the amount is that you just paid out.
So I think the
Or we
figure here
spend
is in the report. It's £25,752 in 24-25.
But that's actually the ombudsman.
No, that's
Internal. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, that was compensation to residents.
Yeah, but it was.
Arising.
It was to the ombudsman. I'm talking about outside the ombudsman.
We don't, no, I looked into it and I'm trying, reporting is something I'm trying to improve at the moment, so it hasn't been properly recorded. It's useful to record it on the system, it's just at the moment getting it done.
Yeah, because that will be good.
And there's a
That's
facility to there. But
So
it's
we might be
recommending
that
information is routinely captured in future.
It's in the public spending, the published spending files that are online.
And Chair, I have one.
Sorry.
So. I see this.
One more question?
The final one is on the systems of the digital system. I went to one of the GCCs and there's a new portal, there's an internal portal that where residents are encouraged to log their complaints. I think it's from an external party.
Yes, we use our casework.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And I think the feedback has come back that it's pretty clunky.
So we've been using that system for about.
I think it was just
5
released in
years.
September, no?
No,
Is that repairs?
5 years.
Yes, the repairs internal portal system.
Ah,
That's just been released. And
I don't know anything about the repair system.
Yeah.
We'll have to take that away. So
Because
what's the feedback that it doesn't work?
it
very
is
well?
very friendly. People have said that they actually put off using it. It's pretty clunky. And I think it'll be interesting to see how much.
There have been some teething issues identified with it, that as I understand are being worked upon and ironed out.
Yeah,
They did a resident conference last weekend. They have launched it. It's had teething problems and they are working on it. So
I think I've heard, it's not specifically related to complaints, but I'll take this away. Absolutely.
yeah. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Sorry, Claire, no, Will was next.
Okay, I just want to refer to 1.7, first page, page. That's a fairly strong statement the LG CEO made. And I'm wondering whether, again, supporting what Pretty said just now, that a really effective use of case management of an issue and working with the resident before it becomes a complaint. It rings a bell because I went on complaints training last week, and so the first category of complaints aren't complaints, they're issues. And if it can be solved that issue, that you work with the person who brought the issue and therefore resolve it, and then you don't have a complaint which then becomes adversarial, more complex. So it strikes me that at the lowest level of interaction, or the initial level of interaction, if competency of process and result, you don't just let plumber comes and fixes it and then it leaks again and it's a separate visit. It isn't a completed visit until the pipe stops leaking. It's not the fact that the plumber's paid, it's that kind of difference. And we get that feedback from housing estates for ours, housing estates for registered providers, private landlords. So it isn't all related to council property. But it's just basic competence at the foundational level of this. Well, prevent a lot of things escalating to be in place. And the same is true in school management and other spheres in hospital where I'm covered as well. So, I think this is a lesson that we need really to learn. That there's solid foundations of getting the simple things right, both in terms of actuality, but also in terms of process and reporting.
So, do you want to spoke?
No, I think we and what we look for in complaints data is trends that indicate that in particular areas we're making mistakes repeatedly that suggest there's a systemic issue with the level of competence in service delivery. And that's why complaints data is so valuable, because if something has failed to the extent that someone needs to escalate it to a complaints process, we need to understand if there's a systemic issue or a one-off issue behind it, and that's how we learn as an organisation. So it's really, really important.
Claire and then
Liz. First of all, on the housing complaints, Councillor Gardner and I were wondering whether we could bring these to Housing Community Scrutiny Committee, perhaps in January. That's one point. I have another point, which is just a quick question as to whether some of the issue around addressing complaints well might be to do with defensiveness. And if so, that could be a cultural thing, which if we move more strongly to a low blame, high accountability culture, we might get more of the complaints right at the first stage. I also have some questions from Councillor Benton, Mary, if you will allow it. So the broadest issue is that there aren't any connections drawn in the report to staffing, only training. Things like SEN withdrawal are obviously a function of policy and budget, but that's not mentioned. Complaints about officer attitude in family services apparently are very common. Obviously, the department is under-resourced, and frequently cases involve harsh penalties to struggling parents, including prosecution.
I'm not sure that's a question. And is that shown up by the figures?
We need training isn't doing it. We need increased staff per case and better hiring incentives. What's the officer's response? That's the question.
Is it?
Because some people, we don't accept complaints about council policy. That is not so where a policy decision is made, or the complaints process isn't a suitable
I think that's not what he was getting at. He's saying a lot of the complaints that come might be a function
or a consequence of absolutely.
And so maybe there is an issue there that policymakers could look at in terms of, are they driving some of the complaints?
So I think what we can do on that is we can make sure, because we report to each executive director quarterly, and what we can do is make sure that in there we're really pulling out, we do the lessons on it, but ask them to look at, are there any that are the consequence of policy that need to be flagged? And I think we can take that away as an action.
Great.
Yeah, we can take that away. There was something else mentioned at the beginning, but I can't remember what it was. But yes, okay, we can take that away.
It was about training and
it was your point about defensiveness.
Yeah.
So yes, we believe that actually there is something in the way in which officers feel about receiving a complaint, and the way residents feel in that response. And we've heard that, and we believe that is an issue for us. And so what we've done is made a specific request as part of the end-to-end review of complaints that process looks at why might a complainant feel they have been disregarded, what makes them feel like that, and also why might an officer feel defensive when they receive a complaint. So we're asking those two specific questions, and what we're doing is using restorative practice to bring officers and complainants together to discuss those questions with a view to coming up with some suggestions about how we support the organisation to move beyond that. So I think it's a really powerful point for us, and one where we really are listening to the review where residents are involved and complainants are involved to help us understand that issue better.
Fantastic, thank you very much. There are a few more questions, Mary, but I'm going to suggest that perhaps Tony might email them.
I think that sounds very good. Yeah, I'm sure that Sophie will take any recommendations and so on board. Now, Sydney, did I see you next?
Thank you, Chair. So if I can turn to page 102, this is sort of a good news story on compliments. I noted the numbers of compliments the council received And just ask the question about the process. Do we speak to people who give us a compliment, whether it's within your department or not, and find out why they give us a compliment? That the lessons learned for the things we're doing extremely well that have meant that a resident has contacted us to say this is fantastic, that can then be shared across the board so that other executive directors with their areas can bring those standards up to an area where someone is actually complementing what the council is doing. We know, of course, the children and family services are both rated outstanding, but I just wanted to know whether we do anything specifically on contacting people who give us a compliment, or do we just ignore them?
We don't actually, and it is something we could think about. We don't routinely, and of course we don't know if other services do, but certainly the ones we receive, we don't routinely contact them to say, why have you done this? But they tend to be quite detailed, don't they?
Yeah.
They do.
They will say, I spoke
So
to
the
so and
compliment
so.
comes into the complaints department.
Yes, we have,
Via the service.
yes, so they come into the service and we ask the service to refer them onto the complaints team who log them in the system. So there will be some compliments that we don't see because people don't bother to forward them on. Because unlike a complaint, there's not a kind of requirement to have them documented, but we're trying to encourage people to do that. But in my experience, they tend to be quite specific. They will say, I spoke to so-and-so today, and I want to say how kind they were, or how quickly they resolved the issue, or how they listened when so they do tend to be slightly more detailed, but it is something we can take away.
The reason I'm sorry to emphasise this, Chair, because if you're getting lots of, we're bottom of, as councillors have said, we're bottom of the league table for upholds, and we're sort of doing okay on the maladministration rate on page 99, but I haven't seen the national figures. But yet people are still complimenting us on doing something. So we're obviously doing something okay, otherwise people aren't going to compliment us. It seems sensible that if you even sample to 1 out of 10 of the compliments, contacted them from the complaints team, find out in detail why are you complimenting us, and then just implement good things that somebody did, and then share that with the people who are getting complaints.
Yeah.
You're then going to cut the number of complaints because you're implementing good practice. And that's, I think, a number of people have mentioned that institutional muscle memory. You've got to share good things with the bad areas so that everybody gets good. Otherwise, we're going to fall foul. As the council said, we're bottom of the league table. Yeah, which is pretty cool.
We'll take that away. An example would be a good idea.
Thank you, Lucy.
My
And then
question
Joanna.
thank you, so actually
Oh,
now.
good, excellent, Joanna.
When I was reading this, I appreciate you are doing a review, but I had looked at things, thought in particular for the housing aspects, whether this actually was a subject for an internal audit review, because I think that might be quite helpful in terms of how to correct it. I also, on the housing aspect, would be interested to know if we can actually distill down into whether complaints, as a number of the complaints referred who were probably dissatisfied with their temporary accommodation, or essentially more so the location as opposed to condition. So actually whether there is by its nature a general dissatisfaction coming through in some of the housing that because people are being placed out of borough, there will be a complaint and annoyance, as opposed to it's substandard temporary accommodation. So I'd be interested if we could drill down on that.
So,
So I think there is some data in there in terms of it breaks it down. However, yes, that is a factor. The location of accommodation, and the fact that it's a very difficult market in London across all boroughs. So that's common across all London councils, given the difficulty in sourcing accommodation. Our analysis, internal analysis, focuses on really, as we mentioned earlier, around the case management and the communication, really. Councillor Pascal mentioned around, that first line of interaction, that's a real opportunity to address some of the concerns, which then escalate. Because often, a conversation with someone, a real, conversation can get so much more outcome than if it's just a, adversarial communication through a complaints process. So that's where we are focusing in housing to try and make as much of a difference. And yes, there will always be an element of challenging the location of accommodation, the affordability, and all the aspects. We have a duty to make sure the accommodation is suitable, and within the framework of suitability, it does allow us to look at locations outside of the borough, and that is difficult. That is difficult for families because they've got their connections and everything here. So that does play a factor.
I think that's very, very helpful when you bring it to the housing scrutiny committee. If you could identify the work that you've done to address this, because I think housing comes out of this very badly. Back to my takeaway.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll be very quick. That segues into very nicely. How do we monitor the suitability of the temporary accommodations that we team up with? Do we have any?
I think that's probably outside the complaints process.
But I think we are looking anyway, so I'm happy to take any questions, Councillor, at the meeting that we are arranging.
I just wanted to draw attention that we're talking about process redesign. That ought to be part of our transformation process, and probably perhaps an exemplar of what we possibly can do with process redesign, both in terms of technology and with discarding redundant parts of the process. So it'd be really interesting to hear about that. I personally would like to just underline how poorly the housing complaints have been dealt with. This is obviously not a criticism review, but 4.94 I think is pitiful. It really is, and it's pitiful because we had pretty much the same report on housing last year, and we do not feel as if we're only 24. Because it's not about what people are complaining about. It's things like staff departures and cases not being adequately progressed are just pretty appalling for a second or possibly even third year running. So I think the strong message is that we take a view of that, and it really is. Clearly, we're not without sin in other areas of the council, but it's certainly dragging our performance to an unwanted low. And it really does. I know it hasn't got lots of things to concentrate on, but they really have to get a grip on this next year.
Harry, May, can I add to that? I agree entirely what you said, but would it be worth asking officers as to when they think they could come back and address that, not just in terms of detail, but also in terms of what they set out to do and how they're making progress?
But I think probably, Claire, you will be having a look in the housing committee at complaints, won't you? And maybe you can add some questions in about the process.
Yeah. And I think there's another way to look at it, following from what you said there, which is that there may be value that housing and communities can offer in terms of making improvements.
Or maybe when you've got a process working group which is involving residents, you maybe could involve some councillors from the Scrutiny Council. Thank you. I think we've got a couple of recommendations there. One is to capture the policy implications from trends, or at least draw them to the lead members' attentions, although they ought to probably be able to construe them from themselves from your report, and to harness the lessons from compliments as well as complaints in a more routine manner.
Be allied with getting basics right, because that's the foundation. Focus on that.
Yes, thank you very much for coming with that report. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to again next year.
Indeed, that's one of the questions, Chair.
And we're going to the revenue and capital financial monitoring report. The last one.
Just Chair, I'm also only silver.
All right. It's not just the fact it's very dull.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Who's going to introduce this?
I'll do very brief. The reports on the officers. I think it's a little bit of a broken record now. Here we are, budget, nil variance. Well done, well run, council.
Nil overall variance.
Nil overall variance. You pick up on that. The bit in bold is just a variance. But yeah, here we are, doing what it's meant to do, delivering outstanding services, price, outstanding precautions, one of the best in the country for adults, improving in housing, and taking on board the complaints we just talked about. And the Labour government's taking a record for that. That's fundamentally what it is. Here we are, managing our residents' money properly, spending within our means. Of course, there are overages and underages in different areas, but it nets off to nil variance. So I'm sort of bringing it to the committee. Obviously, you've asked to see it, but it's one of those that I feel it's such a shame because the amount of work that's gone in getting us to this position over so many years. Now find it's all been scuppered. A policy announcement was put out today that didn't say anything, which seems to be de rigueur for this national government at the moment. So poor bosses are not going to really find out what the budget looks like next year until the 17th of December, which is no Christmas present for anybody. It's just disappointing incompetent national government, frankly. So here we are doing our job, thanks to the officers and thanks to everyone that's made it possible. I'm just really sorry that I know the future is not going to be quite as rosy.
Thank you. Questions?
Thanks very much, Chair. Just looking at detail of this, and yes, well done for still being on track in year. The children's services, a rather large increase there due to a number of individual cases by the look of it. So I took the opportunity to research what the costs of a year's boarding at Eton are, even after the increase of VAT or the imposition of VAT on school fees at £63,000 a year per child. And I appreciate that that's just term time and there are costs during school holidays, but that strikes me as being rather better value for money than some of the individual unit costs we've got for some of the children that we seem to be having to pay for at great expense. So what's going on there? Why can't we? Why is it such poor value for money by the look of it?
So, I mean, I'll let Austin go a bit more detail. Talking to Catherine and understanding the situation, Eton is one school that is available to residents to send their children to. It's a very good one, although not quite as good where I was. But anyway, it's Mary, I know the history. So, but it's fundamentally the different. Parents have a choice, and children are able to go to a myriad of schools. Some of our outstanding schools in Kensington and Chelsea, or if their parents choose to send them elsewhere, completely a choice for them. But the choice exists. The problem that we really have is that there is not enough provision across London to deliver effectively supply and demand economics on this product. We are having to pay what the market dictates, and because the market is so small, the market dictates a very high price, and it's not helped by the fact that residents, I can't someone in Haringey objecting to the construction of a new secure facility for children to live in. So we need to build our way out of this. The council has been looking at whether or not there is a way that we could perhaps modify some buildings in order to do this. But this is something it's a sort of a pan-London problem. And my understanding is that work is ongoing across London to try and look at this sort of cohesively, because we would all benefit from a better sort of supply demand dynamic. But currently it's just what it is, and we're having to pay very high costs for it.
And could we not? I mean, it might be the wrong example, but could we not take some places at schools where they're probably struggling for pupils? I know the school in my ward has lost 15% of its pupil roll. It's not a boarding school, but after VAT imposition, that'll be happening across.
Just so I'm understanding, placements are then very high need secure placements, or
Well, depends what the individual cases are.
Okay. So the very high cost ones are where children require very sort of wraparound care, sometimes two-handed care, one-to-one, two-to-one, and that does require very specialist accommodation, of which there's simply just not enough in London.
All right, I'll leave it there.
Pretty level. Page 163. Again, small for social care. I've noticed there's a stark increase of 12% in community support services such as home care and direct feeds, which is pretty high compared to the 1.2 in 23 and so on. Is there thorough monitoring the direct payments? Do we have checks and balances? Because that's a huge increase.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, it is a huge increase, and the service do monitor this very, very closely. And it is demand for services, as you can see, and as you pointed out, in 22, 23,
1.2%, and now, over 12%. So the service do monitor that, and obviously they try to manage with the budget, and you can see that in the
So
table.
the funds that are given in direct payment are actually used properly and,
Yeah, I'll do checks and balances for that. Absolutely. Yeah. Total, page 178 and 179, the digital data and technology. The bottom paragraph of each page, 20.3, where you talk about, you lost 21 FTEs. And then on page 179, 20.9, we talk about how the D&T are system for transformation plans. I wanted to marry it too, because I felt, have we got the right skill sets in that team for transformation that we need to make critical changes to the council's work when I'm marrying it with having lost 21 FTEs?
Yeah, from the outside, it would appear an odd dynamic to be letting go of people when you're trying to do more work, I suppose. But I think the game has changed. So, 5 years ago, would the council have had anyone who was an expert with AI working within its walls? Suspect not. The world is now that we're having to move into that space, and it may be that we will outsource or bring in external consultancy for that one. But we're making sure that our sort of cybersecurity back-end systems are safe. We've put more money into cybersecurity this year. You've all seen what's been happening in the news. We want to make sure that we are the hardest one to hack amongst all local authorities. But nothing is completely secure. So we're making sure that sort of the day-to-day is safe. But we have to adjust the teams to make sure that we're sort of leaning forward to the future as well. And that's a process that's sort of having to go along with it. Fits in with the voluntary redundancy program. We have to say yes to redundancies where they don't fit with the future vision, future direction, and at the same time retain the skills that we need.
Provided we have future in mind. Can I also then just turn briefly to savings on page 159? This is actually still in education. This goes back to the question about the sort of 9% savings that often aren't deliverable, and what we can do to make sure that those savings going forward are achievable and actually still on track. So it's more generic than you just the experience that happens quickly on that page.
Yeah, I think we discussed this last time. I think my answer is quite similar. I think we're in a world where we will have to be putting up savings that might not, by virtue of the pace at which we're having to deliver them, all be deliverable in year. Obviously, this is sort of looking backwards, somewhat looking as we are. We have to get tighter on that. I know Maxine and Drew, the savings and transformation team, have a much tighter handle on the delivery of savings, but it's also the generation of new savings and ideas that come with it that we have to not just have a bright idea, we have to actually figure out how we could implement it, how long it would take to implement, the knock-on effects, those sorts of things. And I don't know what the industry average is, sort of not meeting total savings targets, but I think we could probably nudge that up.
And do we see if there's a frequent offender that actually they look at putting up genuine savings as opposed to I can get bailed out every year by the reserves or by a transfer?
Who are we throwing under the bus? Yeah, no.
Good question. This is only the second year that we've really wanted savings to this level. So I think that's something we could probably take away and have a look at once we finish this year. And rest assured, we've got a lot more detail now in Appendix 2 of savings, and we are really trying to track those closely with our colleagues in the savings and transformation team, because we heard earlier tonight there's more savings in the budget now, and there's everything else, so it's even more critical that we deliver that.
I think there's slightly a savings to stop something is quite different to a transformative approach to savings, where you will hit barriers along the way. If you're on leave, you might be able to deliver it. So, I think as we move into a more transformative approach, we're going to have a bit of malleability within the year, and reports like this will show us how we're sort of managing that. throughout the year.
And if I can just add to that recommendation, that it's not just the frequent offenders, it's the types of savings that are often unachieved, because you do notice generally extra income. Well, so I would typically say that when people offer that they're going to earn extra income, that's quite often an unachieved saving in the end. And we are heading, by the looks of things, back towards 13% unachieved this year, 10% definitely unachieved, 5% sort of, at risk. And if most of that comes up, we're back at the same level. And I'm not sure whether 13% is perhaps good compared to other local authorities or not, but it seems a bit hard to me. And so that analysis that Joanna suggests, I would recommend we had in touch. But anyway, sorry, enough from me. Lucy, and then
I was just going to ask, given the significant inflationary pressures coming through and with the underestimated pay award, how confident are we that AIC cost pressures are genuinely under control, and what early signs would tell us that further mitigation is needed?
Yes, so obviously we do this quarterly monitoring within the department. Adult social care in this instance, they do a lot of work to track this, and again, I think we can see that with their forecasting is usually pretty accurate year on year. It's getting tougher because I think inflation is going up. So what we do every year as part of the budget setting process is we with a piece of work within the service who use inflation to try and understand what they need. It's never a science, it's always an art, because we don't know what inflation will be. We also are driven by the market as well. We talked about it with schools, and we talked about it care placements. The market drives the costs sometimes, so we won't always get it exactly right. We do work really closely with the service and get it right and to try and hit it. I think we're in the winter period now, that can have additional pressures on particularly adult social care as well. So we'll be close eye on that, and we'll report back at quarter three.
And we're taking a slightly more conservative approach, not surprising. More conservative approach for things like inflation, interest rates. They're very volatile at the moment. Yields are moving up and down almost every time the chancellor announces something and then takes it back again. So we're trying to price and make sure that it acts in our favour, coming in under the interest rate or under the inflation rate, rather than being unhappily surprised when the ONS puts out figures.
Yeah, okay.
That's more general.
Chair, just a quick question. On page 169, it's the bottom of 16.8, but it's digital transformation. It mentions that there's some AI tools that have been developed in-house specifically. I just wondered whether, it mentioned they've been developed and they're being trialled. I wondered what other areas of the council we can improve with them to develop in-house AI tools. I'm obviously thinking housing, so that we can improve our efficiency whilst our headcount goes down to save costs.
So I learned about one today that we've implemented. So it's in parking. We now have an AI that will read car logbooks, will read car insurance documents, and effectively approve or not approve whether or not they are legitimate applications. I think this is one of those spaces where there's going to be lots of little things happening all of the time, because AI could be as simple as asking Copilot to read your email and summarize it, and it can go all the way to draft a model about our investment plan for the next few years. So that I think we could be stronger on having a sort of a grid of all the projects which are ongoing. I think that's something that I would welcome as well, so that we know what we're likely to be delivering.
But we have that grid.
Not in a sort of cohesive plan. It's because all departments have been sort of embracing AI slightly at their own pace, I think. Let's say that. I'm looking to try and make sure that in the years that in the few months ahead, we actually can really put our finger on where AI, and not just AI, but just general sort of computer automation, can help us do some of these big transformative changes. Because it's amazing that live translation now exists to help with the 80 languages that are spoken in this borough versus having to pay someone to translate an email.
Yeah, and I might add to that actually that one of the savings and transformation work streams is around process reviews, and there's some detail in 32.7. That's some funding that's been agreed exactly around sort of automating and improving efficiencies of processes. And any sort of details where they are, it's around core transcripts, and other things around social care, so automating transcription of case notes so that social workers are obviously able to focus on more of the high value adding work rather than the athletes.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well,
Couple of points and then a question. First of all, I wanted to re-emphasize that a delay or slippage in a capital investment program is not a saving. It may be a way of managing the budget, but it's probably in the end ends up being more expensive. And also, I'm glad to see in here that we're not going to lose in the zero variance the lessons of those things which are showing a direction of trouble or of solution issues in the future. The question is a pretty simple one. It's whether the success in implementing under 1.12 the ERP tool and whether the success of that is going to give us the foundation to build the very basic ability to run a case management system within the borough across departments. So, because having had been through as a councillor and a lead member at the time of the implementation of BT, when we couldn't even pay our teachers, we had to take cash around to our teachers in the schools to enable them to live and pay their mortgages. Never want to go there again. And I hope that that it will be robust in the things that it does do. Also, if it's as capable as it should be, provides the foundation of which we can have a very effective case management system. I take the point on AI. I think it's brilliant and the rest of it. If we don't get the bread and butter basics right, we won't have a foundation on to build trust and AI and all the other things that go on top of it.
I completely agree. I think the digital skeleton that we're building of having a good ERP, good CRM will allow us to butcher and sort of add on other limbs onto that one. We looked at it with complaints earlier. You need to be able to see it. The same person is complaining into housing as they are complaining into environment to understand if the problem is actually multifaceted rather than simply two different issues, which it may also be. But in order to sort of realise the bigger savings in the years ahead, we have to have that cross council access point so that people can sort of understand things and look into different bits of data. The sort of the feeling I have that I know this will all be very helpful, but we need to now bring together exactly how it's going to be really helpful and put together a proper plan of what we're going to do once we build the skeleton, because there are no endless number of companies trying to sell us lots of bits to bolt on. We need to make sure that we are establishing exactly which bits we do want, and then making sure that they all do talk to each other internally, and that's where the sort of internal DT&T team is going to be so valuable. Again, talking about parking today, we launched it, our CRM, now planning to expand it so it talks to council tax, but we're also consecutively adding on this sort of AI data validation tool, and we can keep building on as long as you've got proper fresh. And I think actually it's been quite good at having a clear out and moving to Oracle and just sort of starting fresh.
And on the resilience side of that, you have to also understand how you deal with a situation when somebody calls the plug, literally, be it the internet plug or be it hacking plug or be it the electricity plug.
Yeah, well, we saw with AWS going down just a few weeks ago. It turned out a lot of UK was being installed on the East Coast of America.
I'm sure this is something we'll pursue as a line of discussion as we talk about transformation as well.
Yeah.
Any other points? I was just
on the DT systems, how many are we still reliant on external support?
People?
Oh no, the system itself.
I'm not going to have an answer for you on that one. It's going to be on.
Most of them.
A lot of them.
Right.
We tweak some once we have them to fit suit our needs, but
is that
I don't think build a system great from the ground up internally.
There might be some small local ones in areas, but big systems we use are generally out of postal bias and things.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask about going back to internal variance within budgets, which is overall, practically comes back to the bill, is overall a sign that we need such a prudent budget with enough latitude to allow that. As budgets get smaller, I get more worried by internal variance. And so is there a budgeting measure of various, like a kind of standard deviation that we could show against each business group? I don't know what level you'd go down to indicate that variance, but I think that could be a good sign of where there are problems. I mean, obviously we have the details, so we can work that out for ourselves. So I think it'd be quite interesting to look at the overall deviation within budgets. I hope I've explained myself.
Yeah,
correctly.
yeah, and we could do that, but I would
No,
say.
I don't want you to spend hours doing it.
No, I would say we should step back one step before that, get the budgets in the right place in the first place. And the team are doing a great bit of work at the moment now. We've got Oracle to look through and try and make sure I've got the budgets in the right place. So, you know, sometimes when you read this report, children as an example, you know, overspending here, underspending here, actually, if we get the budgets right in both places, and we wouldn't have any variance. And I think that would be a better place for us to be. So we're trying to get the budgets. I'm looking to Lucy because she's leading the team.
I agree with that, but it'd be quite nice to have an indicator to show us that you've got to that stage. So it's just a suggestion, and I'm not going to make a recommendation of it. But I just think in terms of us reading a budget quickly and seeing how much you've kept, despite the overall figure, how much the budget is really a reflection of what we've planned for the outturn, I think it would be helpful.
We can absolutely do something on that.
So I think our main recommendation from this paper was the analysis of unachieved savings, both by frequent clients and types. Not to point the finger in blame, but just to try and understand the misfiring of savings.
Yeah, and also the income not achieved as well.
Yes, sorry, yes, I meant
Mary, I
that
think-
under the same overall umbrella, but you're absolutely right.
I think also the area of just getting ERP to really work in practice and build the other systems on it, because you know this council nearly stopped functioning entirely when we went through the BT process, and I'm confident we won't go that bad this time. But there's opportunity of having a really reliable engine, well applied. It's not particularly sexy in terms of headlines like AI and the rest of it. If we get the basics right, we can then build reliably on that, and it will also start to build back trust in the council because we can answer questions earlier, truthfully, without having to be defensive and all that sort of stuff. So, particularly, I think ultimately, housing areas. This is you need that at a very solid base to work on.
So just to manage expectations, Oracle won't be able to do everything. Oracle is very much focused on finance and HR and procurement.
Yeah.
But we are absolutely going to utilise that system to use all of the bits we can, and we're not using it fully at the moment. We are continuing to develop it, but it wouldn't hold housing complaints. That would be a simple system.
Right. Okay. But they have to be aligned and really need the same rigor of process.
Absolutely.
Quality assurance.
Okay, I can bring that item to a close. Thank you very much for being late and that we'll just on the page. Start from 255. 255. Okay, so paper A8, we've already done A9, and you were going to come with a list rather than going calling through the pages. So if I just ask Claire if you've got anything you wanted to
Yeah, I have a general point, which is the amount of procurement that is here. There seem to be an awful lot of decisions on procurement, and I had a very interesting discussion this afternoon about open competitive tenders and not. So I wanted to just mention to the committee that maybe there's a sort of general piece that we may look at around procurement. There's so many individual pieces. I'm not suggesting all of them.
You had procurement come and talk to us a while ago, didn't you?
Because I think there are new procurement rules.
Yeah, there are.
But I also wonder about how we are doing on open competitive tender per se. And sometimes perhaps the costs around that, there may be inefficiencies there in terms of transformation. So that was the general point. On page 259 at the bottom, we've got the housing revenue account budget set in the business plan, which I don't think is mentioned as coming to HDFC, but it is.
It's in is it December, yeah.
So that's what's out there.
Yeah.
You might want to
I
add it in.
will update that.
It'll be out of date next time. And that doesn't work. There's also quite a lot of direct awards, and it doesn't mention who the incumbent providers are of any.
Is the housing?
No, this I'm looking at, for instance, page 266, advocacy service for adults, learning disability, continuation of home care services, violence against women and girls. Then for housing and communities, I wondered, can we have a briefing on the implementation? This is on page 272 of the updated housing management according to the connect policy. Please.
Do you want a briefing note on that?
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
That's like the committee.
Yes. Things like West London Floating Support Service, I think these are things that all councillors need the information on.
The West London, are you talking about page 275? So
I exactly can, yes.
So procuring something on behalf of.
Yes. But if there is a floating support service, it would be good for councillors in their casework to know about it.
Oh, that's
Think about for induction of new councillors perhaps next time.
All right, that's the induction programme.
Yeah. Procurement. Sorry, Mary, I was quickly. Direct. There's a lot of direct.
Very simple one. The two clauses, 253 pages, 4.3 sets out an ambition. 4.7 talks about the reality.
Sorry, well, which page are we on this?
253.
Yeah.
And it's in the general text. 4.3 is the first point. Well stated. That's your report.
About the actual,
It's not in the charts.
Yeah.
And then 4.7 on the next page. So 4.3 talks about the ambition, and 4.7 talks about the reality and the difficulty, and how the chair is going to consultation member together with the committee draft a reference report. The leadership team summarising the committee's views and recommendation. I think that's an extremely good point, because I know for years this can be a rational process, and you're still finding it difficult, and you're still finding resistance from some elements of leadership and officers. And therefore, I think it's worth us supporting you as a committee with a recommendation.
Minishing that's important.
That states that the committee chair can consultation with the members of the committee will draft a reference report for the leadership team, summarise the committee view and recommendations. I totally support that. It's just we do it in a certain time frame. What time frame do you like to do it?
I think you're confusing the point in the report in that if a KB doesn't align with the meeting cycle, then
I'm just talking about there's the ambition stated in 4.3, and there's the reality at the point beginning 4.7 when it may be difficult.
It is.
But it then goes on to say that it's going to be the recommendations. I think we ought to have an agreed way of dealing with the fact that the cycles don't always meet.
Right. So most of what we do in the scrutiny team is we on your behalf, talking with you.
I know that, but it says that you're going to write a report.
No, that's what that is intended to say, is that if there is a KD that's looked at outside of the meeting, then a reference report will then be drafted to go to leadership team. So, for example, although it wasn't the workshop, I will make your amendments to the draft transformation report and confirm it. And that will go to the 10th December leadership team.
Maybe I'll reword it. That I know, because we've had conversations between us many times, that there's a frustration in the management of this process, not due to anything lacking on your side. So there is sometimes you don't get much support, as you could do from both officers and lead members. And I think that if you feel that there's something there that could be improved in that process, I think we as a committee
There's a lot of chipping away going in the, on in the background at the moment.
So, I mean, I would just like to have it visited that we support you in your efforts.
Thank you. Yeah.
And if you would like to come up with a formal way of improving it, I would suggest that we look very carefully at supporting you with that.
I will do. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Claire and then Greg.
Sorry, there was just one more. I knew there was one, and it is on page 288, temporary accommodation and placement policy. They're looking at suitability criteria, which I know came up with this paper. And so I would like to flag that one for my committee, please.
You want that to come to your committee? Good. Yeah, okay, that sounds like a good one. Greg.
Sorry, so bottom of page 261, annual resilience report. I wonder if that's something we should consider in this committee. I don't want to push it one way or the other really hard, but I'll raise it to the discussion amongst us.
That is going to the audit and transparency committee.
And
Going
data
to talk
centre
about
that stuff.
and you spoke to Gerald about that, didn't you? Yeah. So it's
Because
actually
they're
going to that
managing risk,
committee.
I suppose.
It's.
I can have it circulated to
I
us.
could definitely let you have it.
I've never really understood why this committee doesn't get involved with risk, because it's so fundamental to scrutinising the council. And we did once have years ago have a joint meeting with audit and transparency when we went through the risk register. Maybe that would be something we could consider doing really after the election and in the next council year rather than now, because
And I occasionally have sort of meet sort of powers with Gerard about
You do.
joint issues, but
I've done a report for Mary and Gerald on scrutiny and audit committees and how they can complement each other. So I'll tidy it up a bit if you want, and I can circulate that around you if you'd be interested in that.
So we might in that perhaps consider whether Greg suggests an annual review, joint review of the risk register might be something that we ought to do. Just good housekeeping.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks,
It
Mary.
would help with your work programme as well.
It's just.
Anyone else got any key decisions? Yep, Jeremy, sorry.
Just one correction on 262. The homeless activity strategy isn't going to be available until late summer. Right, so that's changed. So that just needs to change. And then my only other one, I would like to see outside of committee page 269, the violence against women and girls as women affected. I understand you again on that. Thank you.
Yeah, going to be circulated outside. Yeah. Good. Anyone else? Which case, I think we've done paper A9 and it's all yours. And it says no, in the absence of any urgent business. Thank you. It's a long agenda, so I'm sorry it's no time to discuss budgets. Yes. And it's just something that's